Module 2 looks at, okay, what secondary data sources are out there. And then Module 3, we're going to look at, okay, if I've got to collect my own primary data, what does that look like? Well, let's start talking about secondary data first. So secondary data is basically data that was compiled by someone else and is now available to you. So this can be US Census data, it can be Census of Agricultural data. So it's data that's out there, somebody else collected, and you can use it. And so that's what I was saying. Usually these are collected by political boundaries. County, sometimes census tract. And use available data before investing in new research. So you really do need to go out there and look, what is the secondary data that's out there that's available in my community, in my area? And it's a lot cheaper to use secondary data. So if there's really good secondary data out there, use that first before investing in new research, but also know that you not only look, is the data there, but what's the quality of that data? And each data set is going to have strengths and drawbacks. And so some of the value of secondary data, there's abundant information available from local, state, federal, and private sources, and it's usually free. Some of the secondary data costs money, but there's a lot of free information out there. And it provides essential insights rather rapidly. You can see how somebody else collected the data and posted it. That takes a lot less time than collecting your own data. It's typically in pretty standard formats that you can compare, and it's often comparable across regions, across time. So they collect it for the whole nation or the whole state, and so you can compare your region to other regions. What do you think are some negatives of, or some challenges with secondary data? Has anybody run into this?
Well, there's a lot of differences in regions, and it may not collect data that you're interested in, or it may omit something that you are interested in, for example.
So tell me if I'm paraphrasing wrong, but basically it might admit what you're really interested in. You weren't the one that got to ask those questions and write those questions, so it might not be getting at what you want to get at.
The information usually lags real time.
It can be old. So as you, Dave?
A lot of it's suppressed. We just don't get information, especially on smaller counties.
Yep. Dave was saying a lot of it's suppressed. We don't get information, especially on smaller counties. So that's the idea of keeping confidentiality. So they won't report it if there's less than a certain amount of producers of that type in the county or something like that.
And I don't know if this falls under Dave's category of suppressed, but a lot of farmers just don't even report, because that's that part of that under, kind of under the radar direct market sector, and they may not fill out the ag census, or so they're not counted at all.
So a lot of the farmers won't report, and so that also brings to the quality of it. Sometimes you weren't in control of it. You don't know what the quality is. Sometimes if it's a, like US Census data or something like that, you have a good idea of what the quality is and what that looks like. But a lot of times if you get it from somebody else that's maybe a smaller source, you don't know what the quality was. You don't know what standards they adhered to when they were collecting it.
But even the census, the farmer has to report it, and we know for a fact that a lot of these direct market farmers aren't doing that. Mm-hmm. They're not reporting at all, so it's not giving a very accurate picture for the county.
Yeah, the missed farmers, maybe it's systematically missing some farmers. Good. Any other insights of problems you've run into with secondary data? That's a pretty good collection there. Oh, yeah?
We have issues with granularity.
Okay.
We're interested in very small populations, and the data just isn't reflective of that.
Yep. So a lot of times the secondary data doesn't get down to the granular you want. If you're looking at, a farmer's market, you're not going to find the secondary. Maybe, in certain cases, maybe a study's already been done on that farmer's market that you could use their secondary data. But a lot of these big secondary data sources, you're not going to get it to the granularity that you need it at. And so this is one of the things that I think is very valuable about the toolkit. So if you go into Module 2, the toolkit provides extensive lists of secondary data sources by supply chain. So if you go in there, there's a list, noting that this is one thing Becca said, there's a lot of investment going into this area. So they're constantly updating, and maybe there's new sources of data coming out. So knowing that when we wrote this toolkit, we went out and looked at what the best sources were out there by supply chain. And we put lists in there, and we talk not only about, okay, where do you find this data? Well, what's in this data? And so we do it by supply chain, so you can look at the production. We list some of those data sets by production, by food handling, food consumption, demographic and economic context, waste recycling, and then also specialized restricted access data source lists. So we do give you a little of those, but sometimes they can be hard or expensive to access.
And just to say about that, we intentionally do not provide a laundry list. We try to make it a little bit easier because there is an overwhelming amount of information out there. So what we tried to say is collectively from our team, what do we use most? Where do we turn first to try to get data for some of these pieces? And just one other plug here. Hopefully many of you know that there is, for the first time ever, a local food survey that's happening right now by the National Ag Statistics Service. So yes, we still have some of the problems that you mentioned earlier. You know, we'll see how many farmers actually respond, and you know, we know it's a cash economy, and whether or not they actually, you know, put what they're making in there. But we are going to have new and better information than we've ever had before in this space. And so even what we have now, and we'll continue to update, maybe not this hard version of the toolkit, but the website, which is localfoodeconomics.com. You can see it, I think it's on the front of it. Hopefully it's somewhere on there. But so the information is changing in this space. And I will say, because a lot of times when I'm going and working with community groups, they say, well, the secondary data is not great for the X, Y, and Z. You need to really have strong sense that you can do it better than what like the census is doing, for example. It is hard to get this information. So even if it's not perfect, sometimes it's just better to go with what you have because it's available and it's a trusted source, right? If you try to publish something, I mean, if you try to bring something to your local municipal officials and say, I got this data from the US Census or from the Census of Agriculture, that's a trustworthy source versus, well, you know, I tried my best to sort of do this kind of thing. You know, so you really have to have a strong sense that you're going to be able to do it better.
Thank you, Becca. And we'll get into that in Module 3. We'll talk about primary data collection and some of the pitfalls with that one. As I see people kind of peeking at that, are there any questions as you're looking at it?
Not really a question. I just, having followed this data for years, the one aspect that I find tremendously useful for everyone who's interested in this kind of assessment and work, or just knowing more about the data, is that limitations column. It is so, I want to say freaking powerful to people who are being introduced to this data, which is overwhelming for the first time, to have someone just punch it out for them and say, okay, be careful about this data, or this data is really good for this purpose. So thank you so much for adding that column on. It's really very useful.
Oh, good. He was saying that the limitations column is very useful. Any other questions or? And maybe when you have time at the break to look at it and things like that, we could get into it a little bit more if you need to. But I think that's a pretty cool part of the toolkit. So questions to guide data collection. So the quality and appropriateness. So when you're looking at these secondary data sources, and this gets to exactly what he's saying, that limitations column, but which data will tell your story that moves your food systems work forward the most effectively. So certain data sets are better for certain things that can tell certain stories. So what data is going to tell your story? What data is out there that best tells your story? And how precise do the data need to be to serve your purpose? In certain cases, they need to be very, very precise. In other cases, maybe they can be more general or broad. So how precise does that secondary data really need to be, and how does that align with the sources? And how close a fit are the readily available data to the questions you're trying to answer? So as we said before, sometimes they don't ask exactly the question that you wanted, but maybe they have something that's pretty close and it's a pretty close fit. Is that good enough? Is that not good enough? Who collected the data and for what purpose? Is it US Census or is it a for-profit organization? Who was the one that collected it and why did they collect it? And does the source introduce any bias into the data set? So do they have an agenda as they're collecting the data? And if that's the case, you need to know that and understand that. Is the data set appropriate? So when you show your findings to local stakeholders, does the data really reflect their experiences? So is there some ground truthing? Does it pass kind of the sniff test there? Do they align with how you plan to categorize and report the information in your study? And so this could be the right geographic region. And are you able to map the data to provide visual display? So timeliness, this was another one that somebody was talking about. How often is the data compiled? When we look at the US Census, that's collected once every 5 years. So how often is it compiled? How recent do the data need to be useful and persuasive? Did they just collect the data 5 years ago and they haven't collected it yet? Is that okay? Is that not okay? Kind of has a lot happened in that 5 years? Does your community look a lot different now than it did 5 years ago? If they are a few years, yep, that's what I just said. What's changed since the data was compiled? Does it look a lot different now than since the data was compiled, or does it look similar? So one example of one of the data sets that we go to a lot and is outlined in the Module 2 is the Bureau of Labor Statistics consumer expenditure data. So they interview about 120,000 households each year, and they track what households spend for consumer purchases. So 120,000 households, and they track, okay, what are you spending? And these interviews are primary data for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So I'm kind of using this to transfer into Module 3 as well. So for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they're the ones that are out there surveying, they're the ones that wrote the survey. That's their primary data. But if you use that data, it's secondary data for you. And so when summarized into table, keeping individuals anonymous. So it is secondary data for the researchers. So that's a little bit of what Dave got to there, right? So they summarize it into tables. They have the primary data. They have all the details on the survey. But when they report it out to you, they make it anonymous. They aggregate up. And so you can use that secondary data. And so more on that, they post annual reports. And they categorize. So they also do some work for you that might be helpful and make it easier. They categorize the results by income level, by region, by race, by ethnicity, and other relevant attributes. So you can see, okay, how does spending differ by income level, consumer spending? What are they spending it on? Are higher income levels buying more steak, and at lower income levels are buying less meat? Those kind of things. For example, you can look up how much money was spent buying food each year for an average household in one region of the country. And it allows you to calculate a reasonable approximation of the amount residents of your community spend each year, because that can be some important information for you to have. How much do people in my community spend each year on food? And so here's an example of some of that consumer expenditure data for a small city. So let's say it says that total food consumed by households was $83 million. So in this community, households spend $83 million on food. And then it'll break it down even further and say, okay, 2.4 million of that was on beef, 1.7 was on fish, and so you can break it down. How do you think you would use this information? What's one way that this information could be helpful in one of your studies?
The baseline of expenditures versus how much is bought local.
The baseline of expenditures versus how much is bought local. And to expand on that a little bit, if somebody's telling you that, oh no, we sell $2 million in local beef each year, and you're seeing here the total beef consumption is 2.4 million in your community, well, maybe that number doesn't pass the sniff test. Any other ways that you could see this information being helpful?
So trends in what people are buying. You know, there's more chicken. There was some fancy graphic that just came out last week showing this in real time from 1976 or something, that's showing how
very
these
cool.
are going up and how, you know, beef is going down and now poultry is going up.
Good.
So what are the trends in purchases?
Good, so trends, because this data you can get it a time series, so trends, but also she was saying relative to one another, do we eat more, well, by expenditure, do we spend more on beef versus chicken? And I think Becca was about to say something.
I was going to say more than just, if you have a producer who's telling you that they produced $2 million worth of beef or they had $2 million worth of beef sales, you're probably going to say, well, we need to make sure you're looking at export markets, right? Because you don't have consumer demand and it's unlikely that you're going to shift consumer behavior that radically, right? Does that make sense to everybody? So if consumers in your region are spending $2.4 million on beef, and that's the total amount that they're spending on beef, and you have a farm, a ranch, that says that they are selling $2 million worth of beef, right? They have $2 million worth of output of beef, then it's unlikely that that single producer is going to sell all of their beef in a local market. unless consumers start spending a lot more on beef. Does that make sense to everybody? Right? And it's usually an unrealistic assumption to think that you are going to dramatically change consumer behavior. As many of you probably know from working in the field a lot more than I am these days.
Thanks, Becca. I might actually, since you were.
Okay, I'll just say. So this is our last slide on Module 2. This is a study. Are any of you familiar with this Vermont study, the Vermont Farm to Plate Network, and the study that they did in their state? Nobody's familiar with this? So Vermont, they're much smaller. It's harder when you're in North Carolina and Colorado, but they're a small state, and they've done some really innovative things with their food planning. They put together this study, the strategic plan, Vermont Farm to Plate, in, I don't know, it was at least 5 years ago, maybe more. I could lose track of time, but you should look it up. It's very impressive what they've done and how networked they all are. But when they were starting to put together this study, we actually have someone from University of Vermont, David Connor, who's on our toolkit team, and hopefully I'm not butchering this story too much. So he said that when they initially put together this, they wanted to have some kind of baseline of how much food that was produced in Vermont was consumed in Vermont. This is really hard data to get because we don't track that kind of information on a state level, right? We don't pay an extra tax, for example, which is how this information might be tracked, if you're going to sell it across state lines, right? There's not a tax exactly in that kind of scenario. So they had heard anecdotally that 4% of the food, it was 4 or 5% of the food that was consumed in Vermont was grown in Vermont. And they just sort of heard this number anecdotally, and people had been using it, right? We all have those numbers in our communities. But they said, hey, if we're going to put together a strategic plan, we need to be very, very clear about our baseline because we want to be able to track. And the difference between, even 3% and 4%, that's a substantial difference. So they actually went out, they're in Vermont, so they can call up all of their neighbors and everyone, and they can find out, well, how much of the food that we're producing is actually sold locally. And when they went and did that, and they did it as comprehensively as they could only account for 2% of the food that was produced that was consumed in the state. So what's important here to understand is that they went and looked at secondary data sources as much as they could and realized that they really needed to go and collect primary data because this was a piece, going back to what Becky was saying, that there's some places where you want to make sure you work to get those numbers right, and it's some places where it's okay to have kind of an estimate. This was a place they worked to get it right, and so they did the best they could, and they had to go and collect primary information. So with that, I think we're going to transition to Module 3. And how are we doing on time here? I think we're okay. We're good? All right.
You're saying the secondary data showed the 2%?
No, they went and collected
Okay.
primary information.
And have they looked at a change, or we don't see a change yet?
I think they have, they're doing an extensive evaluation and monitoring job, but I haven't been tracking it as closely, but they're very transparent, so you should be able to go on their website if someone Googles this and find out exactly where they are. And it's really impressive, and most communities are not capable of doing the kind of work that they've been doing in Vermont, to be blunt about it. We talked about sort of community readiness, but it's really impressive how they've set up subcommittees, and it's a very impressive example. Oh.
That last slide, if you could pop back.
Yeah.
For a minute. I guess you mentioned the word local, and if there's a farmer who says that he's got this much beef to sell, or she's got this much beef to sell, and there's only 2.4 million in sales there, the whole word local, I think, for across the nation is always to be determined. And I think one thing here in North Carolina that we've got going for us are some aggregation opportunities at a regional level where when you say export, I think some people might think that that's, to another country.
Yeah.
But could you just share a little bit more about the context of exporting from the community under the assessment to?
Yes. And I think that that's one of the things that this assessment can do, is that how you define local or regional might be an iterative process, right? If you see something like this for your community and you realize that, if you're in a rural place and you have a lot of production and not a lot of eaters, that you might want to actually define your local region, much more broadly, because that's going to create new market opportunities. I have to say that in terms of the definition of local, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I really don't like having these debates about mileage, and I think it misses the point. I think when communities are trying to talk about local food systems, that there's the values that are embedded there, and they're trying to usually find opportunities to support regional economic development, improve farm viability. Maybe they want to improve access to certain consumers to, healthy kinds of foods or quality kinds of products. And so those conversations can drive what your region is. Who is the community you're trying to help? Where are the farm workers coming from? Where are the employees of the people along the supply chain coming from? And we're going to have a larger conversation about that when we talk about what we talk about as economists, sort of a functional market area, and using that kind of definition. But so I think thinking about the supply chain and your sort of food shed makes sense. The reality is that because of some of the data challenges, we're stuck to political boundaries most of the time, and that most of us are answering to somebody, and that often can be a political power that be. And so that also sometimes drives the conversation.